I'm Paul Amos, founder of The Redeemed. The Redeemed is an organization that creates a community for men of all backgrounds to come together to discuss life's difficulties as well as the triumphs over those difficulties. Today, we're honored to have Scott Smith on the show to talk about his ministry, Banished from Eden, and a little bit about what he's doing to help men recover. Let's start today, Scott, if you don't mind, with what the question we ask all of our guests. What does redemption mean to you?
Yeah, redeemed in the Christian sense to me means that Christ bought back those that he had chosen before the foundation of the earth. And because once you're purchased back by Christ, he won't lose one. And so for me, it is probably the greatest piece of information or hope that you could possibly come up with.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think about my own past and about how knowing that God had redeemed me ahead of all the things that I've done and all the places that I can continue to improve as a human being, knowing he goes ahead of me is the ultimate comfort. If you wouldn't mind for a moment, I've had the chance to hear a little bit about your background, but maybe you could, for our audience, talk a little bit about your journey, what took you away from God and what brought you back.
Yeah, thanks for asking. It's quite a journey. I grew up in a physically abusive home and multiple divorced. Our parents divorced multiple times, and most of the time raised by a mother, my brother and I, and in the midst of all that, grew up pretty heavy in the prosperity gospel and kind of name it, claim it, and all that kind of stuff. And it's an odd thing to grow up. To grow up in an abusive household. From a young age, you learn to compartmentalize things pretty quickly. And what happens is that the person that's hurting you is actually who you run to when you need protection. So it creates this really perverse view of God, in my opinion. And then you layer on top of that multiple levels of bad theology, and you have quite a disaster brewing on your hands. And I'm a guy who left home at 17, never looked back, and ended up meeting a girl in college, and her mom was so kind and generous and loving to me. I slept on her couch a lot, which was more peaceful than the fraternity house in which I resided. And she cooked for me. She doted on me. And so fast forward several years after marrying her daughter, and she ended up passing away. And she had a stroke and found cancer. And we spent a lot of time praying and taking authority over things. And God chose that path for her, to take her. And so it began to create a ton of questions inside of my head, and trying to understand, why didn't this work? If we can speak these things at will and make them happen, why weren't we able to do that? And it began it took 2 years for me to completely lose my faith. And during that time, I read a lot of books. I conversed with a lot of experts. I spent a lot of time with a lot of different pastors, and so finally renounced my faith and became sometimes I refer to it as an atheist. I was probably more of an agnostic. I just think that I think the Big Bang theory is laughable personally. So I always felt like there was some type of higher power. And maybe that was just based on growing up in the South and having it so ingrained in your daily DNA. And so then and I was an agnostic atheist for around 10 years. It's about how long it took. And then I was radically saved by God. He just never lost track of me, and was gracious in my rebellion, and lined up some pretty amazing things that brought me back to him. And so, as I like to say now, he showed up in an amazing way in my life. And I may always have questions, but I'll never doubt ever again.
Well, that's an amazing testimony. Thank you so much for sharing. If we can go back a little bit to, the physically abusive home so much of our audience has had abuse of one form or another. And I'm curious what coping mechanisms you developed, and how did you try to unlearn those as you became an adult?
Uh, man, that's a good question. The coping mechanism that I used most was manipulation. I tried to control everything, every scenario, and control the people in my life, and constantly tried to. It kind of became a really twisted thing because you're trying to control them because so you can feel like you're in control, and at the same time, being able to control them brought value to your life. And then it was like you were worth something, and what a terrible, what a terrible coping mechanism. I think that, and then I think typically um, kids from those types of past learn to compartmentalize so early that they're able to move on quickly. And so I think the coping mechanism is, let's say you had to deal with grief, for instance. I've been talking about this some lately in my personal life. The final stage of grief is acceptance. But when it comes to people who can compartmentalize quickly, like when it comes to me, I don't spend a lot of time dwelling on things that are beyond my control. I readily accept them and I move on quickly. The downside of that is I readily accept them and move on quickly. So have you ever really dealt with what was there to deal with? If you fast forward through, let's say to the final stage of acceptance, have you missed some of the other stages you probably needed to spend at least a couple of minutes in? So I'd say those are my two biggest coping mechanisms.
Well, thank you for sharing those. It's something I can't say that I've personally experienced, but I hear so much about it, and it has such a profound impact, not only on people's childhoods, but on their adulthoods. Trauma is something that is a constantly evolving, part of people's lives, and it's something that I think most people have to work through on a daily basis.
Mm.
You talked a little bit about almost a decade away from God, and obviously the loss of someone as important as your mother-in-law can be critical to that. But what if you could talk about the things that kind of culminated in bringing you back, and what was it that ultimately helped you make the decision to go back from agnostic to now what is a profound faith?
Yeah, so there were several things that, standing on their own, you might say, man, that is quite the coincidence. When you begin to stack them all together, it just points to a loving and caring and personal God. And for instance, my wife, the further away I went, the closer my wife went towards God, which became pretty annoying in our household for for some time. And so one of the church she went to, I ended up meeting a lady, and that my wife brought home from her church, and um, the resemblance to her mother was uncanny. It was kind of freaky, and not just that, but the things she would say, and the voice that she had was exactly like my mother-in-law, all the way down to her handwriting was exactly the same. The first birthday card I got from her looked like it was written by my mother-in-law. And on top of that, she was the same age as my mother-in-law would have been. And even more, she had had two sons, and one had abruptly passed away at 25. Well, he would be the same age as me. And so from that, we initially were drawn, pretty clearly to each other. And it was like God was, I wasn't calling it that at the time, but God was clearly providing some love and some spaces that we were both hurting. Some very personal, and all those things are pretty coincidental. There's no doubt about that. And a little bit later, my wife and I decided to go get some marital counseling. So we were talking to the counselor in the first session, and I said, well, I think I probably need to talk to you on my own. And he's like, well, why do you think you need to talk to me? And I said, well, I'm overly angry. Like I'm angry all the time. he said, well, how long have you been angry? And I was like, I don't know, about 35 years, something like that. And he said, yeah, you probably need to talk to me. And pretty interesting. So we fast forward a couple of months later, and I just had this amazing breakthrough in one of the sessions. And once I left home, I didn't spend a lot of time talking to my mom. She visited a couple times after I had, some kids, but I didn't talk to her much, and for obvious reasons. And I realized that I was carried. I thought I had forgiven her and all that kind of stuff, but clearly I had not. And I realized that I hadn't forgiven myself for a whole lot of things. And this story that I'm telling, it leads into a bit of timing, which had to have God's hand on it. And so I was able in that moment to forgive myself. And when I did, I was able to forgive my mother and realize, in the very next moment, and just kind of broke emotionally and realized that I found out that she was a victim of sexual abuse from a family member. And that caused her to want to control everything. She never was able to deal with her anger issues, obviously, but she was overly protective, and wanted to control everything. And so I saw her for what she was, and I was able to let that go and forgive her, like truly forgive her. Well, a month later, my grandmother passed away, and I saw my mom for the first time in many, many years. And I didn't get to talk to her very much. My mother's side has a huge family, like absolutely huge. And I was kind of working in the room and trying to get around to her. And she was leaving. She wasn't feeling well. And I was checking on her, and I said, well, I hope you feel better. Just call me if you need something, and I'll get it for you. I just want you to know that. And I love you. And then the next day was the graveside service, and she was too sick to make it. And so I called her, same thing, just said, hey, if there's anything I can do, and I just want you to know I love you. So I hadn't told my mom I loved her in 10, 15 years probably. And told her twice inside of 24 hours. And I was working. 2 weeks later, I got a phone call that she passed away suddenly. She just died. And I remember, and keep in mind, I'm still not a Christian at this point, but I remember sitting there, and I don't know if you want to say the word that like bubbled up in my spirit, or the word that kind of, I say, washed over me, was that I was spared. I was spared the bitterness, the anger, the unforgiveness that I would carry maybe the rest of my life, that I was spared that. And that, the last couple of weeks of my mom's life, she heard her oldest son tell her that he loved her. And I was just so thankful in that moment. And so there's a lot to the story, but this culmination kind of happens. I'm with a friend of mine, and we're out in Utah, and we're shooting guns way out in the desert with him and a friend. And I'm out there, and I've had so many things happen. And before we go out, went out there, and I'm just praying, and God had been working on me for months. And there were probably a couple of other things, like I told you, as far as timing goes. And I'm out there, we're in the mountains, and those other guys are in the front seat. And so I'm in the back, and I'm just like, God, I'm listening. I'm open. My heart is softened here, and I'm about ready. I just want to see one more thing. Would you show me a deer? Would you show me a buck? And so for the next 3 hours out in the mountains in the desert, I was looking, eyes peeled, for a buck. And of course, I never saw one. And that's not really how that works. And so got back to the house I was staying at, and I got a call from one of my brother-in-laws who never calls me ever. Said he was just praying and felt like he should call me. And I was kind of a bit of an emotional wreck at that point, and just kind of threw up all over the phone for the next hour talking about all these things. And he's like, well, I guess at this point, what else do you need to see? And I was like, a buck. Did you not hear what I just said? And so we had a good laugh about that. Anyway, a couple of days later, I'm flying home, and I'm standing out on the edge of a jet bridge waiting on my luggage. And I had heard enough. And so I just gave my life to Christ on the end of that jet bridge, and grabbed my bag and headed out to the car, and was headed back to see my family. And I'm driving out of the airport, and something caught my eye, and running stride for stride with the car about 30 yards away was this huge buck and velvety antlers, like right next to the car. And man, I lost it. I lost it in the car. And he ran next to me, for a few hundred yards, and then slowed up and crossed over behind me. Now, I have seen deer at that airport before, but I had not seen them. I've seen deer at that airport since. I had not seen them before. And I was on 48 airplanes that year. So I flew in and out of that airport a lot. And so for me, and some people may say, what a coincidence. And I would say, yeah, what a coincidence, like the other 15 that God lined up that were so personal. And I think for me, it was, God's going to give you enough. And if you step out in faith, that he is going to reward your faith. And I think that day he was just telling me, I see you. And so from that day forward, I'm 1,000% committed, and I'm committed to the restoration of men, and men in the church in particular.
Wow, a buck to come up like that, that is one heck of a finale to a great story.
You should have heard. So I told, that night we sat down to dinner, and I had 3 kids, and they were a bit younger then. And my youngest at the time, he was probably 4. He said, "Hey, Dad, why don't you pray a blessing?" And of course, it was always no. And I was like, okay. And then my girls were older. They're like, wait, what is this? So I tell them the story. And my middle one, she's a pistol. And she's like, "Dad, why didn't you ask to see like a buffalo or something?" And I was like, I should have asked for the buffalo.
Yeah. It sounds like it was a perfect story no matter what.
Oh yeah, man. It's beautiful. It really is.
Well, you mentioned having 3 kids. I know that I have 4, and I know that it's had a profound influence on my kids to hear my story and my transformation. Right before I went under kind of the beginning of my transformation, my second son turned to his mother and said, "I don't think my dad loves me," which is one of the heartbreaking moments of my life. And my transformation has allowed me to come back and be a great dad. Talk just for a moment about the impact that all this has had on your kids.
Yeah. So I have 2 older ones. I have a 17 and a 14-year-old, and those are my girls. And my son is 8. And my redemption was 4 years ago. So my girls, in a sense, have lived this out, and they've lived it. Even though they were young, they've lived us going to church and leading community groups to Dad doesn't believe in God, to this story. So for them, they've got to see it, which is really, really interesting. They saw the whole gamut of things, and it's been an adjustment. I think my wife had to be that spiritual leader and pour into them for years when I wasn't. And I think the bigger things they've seen as far as after me being saved is I work really hard to bring every situation back to, well, what's the Bible say? And everything we do, we run our filter through that. That is our filter, and how we view things, how we approach things. I am much more apt to pray about someone I'm having a problem with, work towards forgiveness and bitterness, and letting all of that go, because we're called to do it, find different ways to love people. We challenge our kids to do the same. And so there's been a huge shift when it comes to that. I also tell my kids, hey, look, no one gets out of childhood alive. Like no one gets out alive. Like everyone's going to need counseling. So just chalk it up. Sometimes it's a big joke around our house. I'm like, well, Dad, what about this? You have to take it up with the counselor later. I mean, that's just all there is to it. So I think and a big difference too is when we do bring things back, the Bible has something to say about everything. And that's a fact about every single thing that's out there. And it's kind of new territory for me and my wife. She grew up in a Catholic home, and it's different for us, new for us to take everything and go back to, well, what does the Bible say? Well, what does the Bible say? And our kids already know. Now they're coming, well, I've got this problem, but this is what I think the Bible says about it. And so we really are laying some good foundations, I think. And in today's day and age, I mean, the moral sands are constantly shifting, so we've got to have that foundation in place.
Amen to that. Well, let's shift for a moment and talk about the ministry that you've put your heart into here, Banished from Eden. Tell me a little bit about the formation of it and kind of what your mission is.
After the breakthrough with the counselor, I still wasn't saved. That's when I started Banished from Eden. And Banished from Eden was kind of a tongue-in-cheek, shot at Christianity. But of course, God always gets the last laugh, right? And so Banished from Eden, Return to the Fight, was born. And while it started off with just restoration for men to overcome whatever it was that took their ability to walk in wholeness and completeness away from them, that was the focus. But now it's really about Christian men being restored, not just spiritually and emotionally, but walking the way we're supposed to. I know patriarchy gets a bad rap in today's society, but God has laid out a patriarchy of authority, and that spiritual authority to provide, protect, love, lead, that falls to men. And there seems to be a tremendous lack of men that are willing and able to do that in the church, or to lead other men to do it. Quite frankly, what I found is that there are plenty of men that are out there that are hungry and thirsty to walk in that, and they don't know how, or they don't have someone to help them do that. And so there are several of us out there that we own our pieces, and that's a big part of mine. And recently have kind of walked through some depression stuff as well, and to find out that there's so many men struggling with that was a surprise to me. And so I think, as far as I'm concerned, as far as Banished from Eden is concerned, it's really just about challenging us and opening a conversation with what does it look like to be restored? What are we aiming at? We don't have a target, right? A lot of churches are trying to downplay or limit or take away what it means to be a masculine man inside of church. And by that, I mean just walking in what Christ has called us to do. And so that's really what it's focused around.
That's wonderful. Yeah, there seems to be so much of a political environment today that is affecting what men should be and what their role should be. Hearing that you're restoring men to their biblical role is not only critical, but good to hear. Tell me for a minute about this environment today and what you're seeing as the places that you're trying to restore people from. I think about COVID, I think about pulling away, I think about all of the things that men are facing in the world today. And so maybe for our audience, you can just talk about some of the struggles that you're seeing men go through and what you're doing to help them.
Yeah, I think in particular, I mean, with COVID, it sure made it really easy for the introverted group to go home and withdraw. And I have seen some pretty devastating effects from that. I've seen the erosion of faith of a very good pastor friend of mine. And it was really, he's an introvert. He's always been on record as being an introvert. And it was easy for him to go, and there weren't enough men around him going and knocking on his door. And we weren't at his church at the time. and just checking on them. And I don't think that's a unique story. I think that is an epidemic that COVID has caused. We as men, we have to be intentional about creating our circle anyway, right? I mean, it's really easy for us to get caught up in our day-to-day responsibilities. And I think that's what happens to me. Like my struggle is like, God's given me broad shoulders and I tend to carry too much on it and not defer enough to him.
Mm.
And I think distraction has been absolutely devastating, not just for men, but just the church and society in general. But specifically to men, I think it's easier to go in and binge Netflix than it is to hop on and binge an apologetics course or whatever it happens to be. I think for me, I just got caught up in taking care of my family. When COVID hit, I'll tell you one thing we did right. One thing we did right is my wife and I said, because when the whole thing first started, right, we didn't know. I mean, it sounded like it was going to be the bubonic plague, that 40% of people were going to die. And so we decided, hey, we're going to try to make this time, our kids remember this time as joyful and not fearful, right? So we spent a lot of time playing board games and shutting off the television and not watching the news and doing all that kind of stuff. But I think a lot of men are scared too, and I think that fear has, at least initially, wormed their way into their life and their psyche, and has caused them to doubt a lot of things. I mean, I see the gamut of emotions. I see just trouble. So for me, I mean, I had to realize here recently that, if you would have said, "Hey, I think you're depressed," I would have laughed it off. I mean, for as far as referring to me, when I think of depression, I think of can't get out of bed. Every day is insurmountable. But as I began to look it up, depression in men manifests in different ways: anger, lack of sleep, up all night, looking for these huge physical achievements. Like I'd already pulled one of my old books out about running a 100-mile race. Like you're just trying to feel something to fight for. And I think that kind of snuck up on me, and I had to come out of that. And I will say, I was told by a counselor, hey, when it comes to depression, you got to fight your way out of it. And I needed to hear those words. I think as men, we're born to fight. And so we're kind of looking for one a lot. And so I would just encourage anyone that's struggled with being at home with COVID, or, I mean, a lot of times apathy is mistaken, and whereas it should be identified as depression. So engage, fight, reach out, look for help. That's why I appreciate the Redeemed.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. And that's what exactly what we're trying to do. One of the things that we encourage is not just having a relationship with our Heavenly Father, but having a relationship with our band of brothers that are in it, a tribe, if you want to use that term, of people out there who can help be supportive. You kind of hinted at that a little bit earlier, but maybe you could talk a little bit about the importance of, iron sharpening iron and men depending on each other.
Yeah, I think it's imperative. I mean, the Christ Church is gonna prevail, right? It's gonna survive. We already read the end. We win the war. I just think that when it comes to men, and we don't have the tribe, as you refer to it, around us, holding us accountable, building us up, encouraging us, praying for us, challenging us to be better husbands and fathers, and even entrepreneurs or just striking out to do things for the kingdom. I think without those things that we are losing a lot more battles than we need to. So that's one, as far as kingdom advancement goes, and what we should be doing, in our thankfulness for being redeemed. And then the other thing is we need it. And it's really interesting to me that it's so easy for us not to engage. It is easy for us to just not do it. I have to be super intentional about, hey man, I'm gonna, this week we are getting together one night and this is what we're going to do. Or I have to almost force myself and them to hold each other accountable to get it on the schedule, because a band of brothers is not, it's two ways it's built. It's built intentionally and spending time together over a long period of time, or it's built quickly in a tragic circumstance, right? And so we want to make sure that we don't want to wait till there's a tragic circumstance. We want to be intentional. We got to realize that some of the things that we don't want to do are really good for us and good for our spirit.
I can totally hear you there, and I can totally appreciate what you're saying. Maybe for one last question, I know that biblical truth is a key component for you, and maybe you could talk a little bit about the importance of maintaining a strict view toward biblical truth, and how you adhere to really what God says.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for asking that question. I mean, the three rules of biblical truth are context, 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 right? Like, so we need to make sure that whatever we're talking about is in context. And because God has a lot to say about everything. And this is our guide. Again, the world is fallen. And we have this thing now where people are talking about your truth and his truth or her truth. And we're really confused now that someone said there's upwards of 200 genders. I mean, this thing's completely out of control. There has to be a fixed point of truth, right? There has to be a truth giver. And so for the Christian, it must be the Bible. God doesn't change. And so every time we have a conversation or everything that we drive to, we have to run it through the lens that God has given us. He's given us his word. He's written it down. I mean, it's like, it couldn't be easier. And I preach hard back to the truth every time, because clearly having incorrect truths was my faith was built on sand. And because of bad theology, I became an atheist. And so truth is paramount. It is the rock upon which we build our faith. And we need to be consistent with what God says, because God's word doesn't come back void, right? There are a lot of people out there who manipulate, a lot of charlatans who are deceiving people. And I get, like my friend that was in the pulpit, I was angry with him because he's leading people astray in their faith and putting them in an area. I mean, I don't know. I don't know about their particular salvation. He's leading people off the narrow path. Now that he stepped down, I'm not angry. He's just deceived. So I want to love him and witness to him. Yeah. And so to me, biblical truth is the only fixed point that's out there, and we need to handle it rightly. God wrote it down for a reason. And in several instances, God repeated himself, which we should be very, very careful with the things he repeated and handle those with care. And so without that, and I think we'd have a lot more unity in the church if we all adhere to the fact that this is true, and let's see what God's saying about it and not what I want it to say.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate you sharing your story about your ministry and all aspects of your life. And thank you for giving us a sneak peek into everything you're doing. And we just thank you for all that you're doing to lead Banished from Eden. To our audience today, thank you so much for taking the time to come and listen. And we hope that it's been meaningful to you. As you know, every third Thursday, we're launching a new webcast. We encourage you to watch. We thank you and hope you'll follow us on social media. Have a wonderful night, and God bless.